Welcome. So we're continuing on our journey to understand the mechanics of the economy, and here we're talking about Chapter 22 in Michigan's Money and Banking text. And the first part of this is our aggregate supply. And so this is going to be the complement to our notion of aggregate demand. And in some sense, it's a little bit easier, but in another sense, it's a little bit more difficult because of the way in which we sort of split aggregate supply into two different notions. And the basic idea of aggregate supply really is to understand what the relationship is between inflation and firms' production decisions. And so that's really going to define this notion of aggregate supply. Before we do that, we need to understand the role that time horizons plays. And the idea here is simply thinking about how firms react to shocks to the economy. And so is it the case that firms have enough time to adjust production decisions, pricing decisions, labor hiring decisions if there's a shock that occurs in the economy? And so that really necessitates this notion of splitting this time dimension in a couple of different ways. And so the idea here is that in the near term, if a shock to the economy occurs, it's going to be more difficult for firms to adjust prices, perhaps because they could be locked into long-term contracts to supply goods at a particular price. So what would happen typically in the near term with shocks is that firms will vary their production. Now, if you think about the way that we define the production function and those kinds of things, we think about the fact that there's a fixed amount of labor and capital and all that kind of stuff. So the way that we get around this is thinking about how firms vary the intensity in which they use those inputs. So you might lay off workers even though the workers are still there, or you'll reduce their hours. You might not use capital as much, et cetera. And so the idea is that in the near term, prices and hence inflation is going to be sticky. And so firms are going to vary their production based upon shocks to the economy. But in the longer run, we think of production and technology being more or less fixed or constant, or better yet, predetermined. Okay, so there's a certain amount of capital and labor and technology that we know is going to be available at some point in the future, at some future time horizon, and that's the productive capacity of the economy, and that doesn't change because it's just predetermined. And so what happens is, in the longer run, we assume that prices are more flexible to be able to clear product and labor markets. And so because of this sort of disconnect between the two, we think of aggregate supply in two different versions. We think about a long-run aggregate supply in which, as we'll see, inflation is going to be perfectly flexible, but output is going to be fixed. And on the other hand, we have this notion of short-run aggregate supply in which some prices are sticky and some prices can adjust. And so we get this sort of inertial effect on inflation, and ultimately it's going to result in a positive relationship between inflation and output produced. So let's look at long-run aggregate supply first. Again, the idea here is that we're thinking about this time dimension as a multi-year horizon. So say 3 years. And again, the idea is that 3 years from now, we know that there's going to be some fixed amount of capital, some fixed amount of labor, and some predetermined level of technology, which when we put that into a production process means there's some level of output that's just going to be spit out of that. So that's our notion of a long-run level of output produced. So what that means then is that these things are sort of fixed or predetermined. Now, it doesn't mean that they're fixed in the sense that they can never change. They're fixed in the sense that they're predetermined, and we can always have shocks to those that move those things around, okay? But those are exogenous to the model. And so the punchline here is that when we put all of this stuff together, then in the long run, output is going to be whatever the potential level of output is given our inputs and technology. And so that really determines the level of output that we can produce, the potential level of output. And that's also coincident or associated with what we refer to as the natural rate of unemployment. And so the potential level of output and the natural rate of unemployment are sort of synonymous in this sense, that that's going to be the level of productive capacity in the long term. And we also make this assumption that prices and wages in product and labor markets are perfectly flexible in the long run, so that eventually those markets are going to clear. The punchline here is that our long-run aggregate supply curve is going to be vertical. It's going to be perfectly vertical relative to our inflation rate. And you can see this in this guy right here. So there's our potential level of output. And again, this is also synonymous with our natural rate of unemployment, okay? those two things mean more or less the same thing. When the potential level of output rises, we can also think of that as being associated with a decline in the natural rate of unemployment and vice versa. So things that can impact the long-run aggregate supply curve are pretty simple. Changes in the capital stock. If we have more plant and equipment and machinery, holding everything else constant, we can build more, we can produce more output. Changes in our labor force. If we have, say, a wave of immigration or we have a bunch of people retiring, that impacts the overall amount of labor that we have to produce output. And so that can impact that long-run aggregate supply curve. Things like technology, how well we put our inputs together to be able to efficiently produce more output. And finally, the natural rate of unemployment itself. That can impact our view of the potential level of output. And this can be this can change due to things like structural shocks. From the financial crisis, we saw a big run-up in the unemployment rate, which resulted in an increase in structural unemployment. That can lead to long-term job loss and people leaving the labor force. And then also efficiency of labor market matching. That can also impact the natural rate of unemployment. So when we put all of this stuff together, that means that these factors really affect the economy's ability to produce goods and services. And in the long run, it really can act to change the potential level of output. And we can see a pretty basic example here if we have, say, an increase in capital, improvement in technology, for instance, or a decline in the natural rate, all of that is going to lead to a shift to the right of our long-run aggregate supply curve. So regardless of what inflation rate you're looking at, your productive capacity has gone up, so you can produce more output. So that's pretty simple. The slightly more complicated one is our view of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So again, this idea here is, what is the short run? What defines the short run? And basically, the notion of the short run is such that if you have a shock to the economy, then there's not enough time, it's a short enough time horizon such that not everyone in the economy can react optimally to those shocks. So if you're a firm, then again, you might have some contracts under specific prices in which you can't adjust those prices. So maybe you adjust the amount of production in some sense, okay? And so it takes time for shocks to ripple through the economy and for product and labor markets to clear fully. And so what we're thinking about is backing up from that point in time. This could be 3 months, 6 months, a year, maybe even 2 years before it takes time for shocks to push through and ripple through and have its full impact through the economy. And so what does the short-run aggregate supply look like? Well, there's 3 basic factors that we can think about that can impact the short-run aggregate supply curve. Ultimately, what we're getting at here is thinking about things that drive the inflation process. What are the dynamics behind inflation and how inflation behaves? There's 3 basic pieces to this puzzle here. The first is expected inflation. So the idea here is simply, if people believe that inflation is going to be higher in the future, then, for instance, households are going to demand higher wages to compensate for higher expected inflation. That's going to lead to higher costs to firms. Firms are going to raise their prices. Higher prices leads to higher inflation. So that's why inflation expectations factor into this. The second here is this output gap term, the difference between total actual output and our potential level of output, okay? And so our potential level of output, again, is just is determined by the long-run aggregate supply curve that we talked about previously. The idea here is that if our output gap is positive and growing, then firms are producing a lot of goods and services. If firms are producing a lot of goods and services, they need a lot of workers to do that. And eventually, you're going to draw down the amount of qualified workers that you can find to be able to competently produce these goods and services. So eventually, that's going to raise labor costs. It's going to raise very quickly. So as labor costs go up, then that's going to result in higher prices that firms charge to be able to produce those higher levels of output. And that, of course, translates eventually into higher inflation. And then the last piece here is this price or supply shock parameter. And so if we assume that output is constant or unemployment is constant, then these price shocks are going to be acting sort of as an exogenous change to the inflation rate. And so we'll talk about how those things might look like here in a second. So if we put all these pieces together, there's a lot that we're simplifying here. But as I said, we have our inflation expectations component here. So this is one of the puzzle pieces. We have this second component here, this output gap component. So this is sometimes referred to as demand pull inflation. So the inflation that's caused by this particular piece right here. And then this gamma parameter here, all that does is translate changes in the output gap to how that translates through to changes in the inflation rate in the shorter term. And then the last piece there is that supply shock term that I talked about before. So you can see pretty simply here, again, we have this relationship between inflation and output. So as output goes up, holding all else equal, you would expect our inflation rate to rise as a result. And you can see that again, here's our aggregate supply curve where we have these components in here. And so that has that upward slope, and our slope parameter gamma there, again, controls that relationship between the output gap and the current inflation rate. Okay, so given that we have this, this relationship, then again, we can look at how changes in the aggregate supply curve are going to be affected. So what shifts those aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve? Again, there's three pieces of the puzzle, so pretty obviously there's three different things that we can sort of characterize as shifting that aggregate supply curve, that short run aggregate supply curve. So if we look at some examples really quickly, we can see, for instance, if there's an increase in expected inflation, then at any given, if we hold our output level constant, then as inflation expectations rise, the actual rate of inflation at any given level of output goes up, okay? Also, again, keep in mind that when we think about output, that's associated with a given level of unemployment. So that's going to raise the inflation rate for any given level of output or any given level of unemployment. If we have a situation where we have persistently large positive output gaps, that can also lead to higher inflation over time. And so the story here is if we have an increase in the output gap, for instance, due to expansionary monetary or fiscal policy, then as we'll see later on, that's really going to drive us along a given aggregate supply curve. Eventually, as we strain our resources, the increase in inflation is going to become so entrenched that people are going to start raising inflation expectations as a result. Again, the intuition behind this is such that if you're producing well beyond the potential level of output, say here at a point of like Y2, then you're going to be straining your input resources. Your labor is going to get scarce, and so that's going to drive up wages. Your capital is going to wear out quicker, so that's going to raise cost to produce. And so eventually, inflation expectations are going to rise, and that's going to shift this aggregate supply curve up. So the persistent output gap story really goes along the same, it's sort of married in some sense with this story about inflation expectations. So eventually you can go from a point like 1 and transition to a point like 4 where you have permanently higher inflation as a result. And in later chapters, we'll talk a little bit more about how we get to that point. And so one last piece that's kind of a nice story, which is going to tie into our understanding of monetary policy and how policy, how credibility is important for monetary policy, is the idea here that temporary aggregate supply shocks can actually become permanently ingrained. And that, again, has important implications for how we think about the role of credibility and inflation, central banks keeping inflation expectations anchored to a low and stable level. And so the idea here is simply, is a pretty simple story. Suppose we have one of those supply shocks, those row things. So we have an oil price shock, for instance. If that's going to be temporary, then we know that row will go up for a little bit, and then it'll come down, okay? And so the story here is simply that, well, if we're defining this thing as temporary, then it should just have temporary effects on inflation. But if it's the case that the central bank isn't credibly committed to keeping inflation low and stable, then even after that row parameter comes back to 0 or back to where it was before, it could bleed through to permanently higher inflation expectations. And at the end of the day, that could lead to, as we'll see later on, a permanently higher actual inflation rate. Thank you.